All right. Hello and welcome. On May 25th, 2020, George Perry Floyd Jr., a Black American man, was killed during an arrest, allegedly for passing a counterfeit $20 bill in Minneapolis. A white police officer knelt on Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes and captured on cell phone video the reality of his final moments is a vivid benchmark in the prolonged history of violence and prejudice against Black people. Mr. Floyd's killing, however, did inspire self-examination and societal examination from people of every race from around the world. Today's 24-hour Dallas webinar, Racism in the Nighttime Economy, focuses on racial disrespect, prejudice, a lack of inclusivity in the sociable economy at night, and what can be done about that. Now, 24-hour Dallas is a all-new, all-volunteer nonprofit organization which has as its mission, let's create a safe, vibrant, and diverse nighttime culture for businesses, residents, and guests in Dallas. Our focus is on the Dallas nighttime economy, those industries and businesses and organizations that thrive at night and contribute to the city's tax base, the arts and cultural organizations, restaurants, hotels, special events, festivals, music venues, tourism sites, anything that bolsters the experience of being in Dallas at night. And our focus is also on those people who enjoy the night and work at night. Sometimes they are the same person. Our webinar guests today are Dr. Reuben A. Buford May. He is a globally respected scholar and professor of sociology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, formerly at Texas A&M University. Had to get that in there. He is also the author of many papers and a book, including Urban Nightlife, Entertaining Race, Class, and Culture in Public Space, which is what drew me to Dr. May. We have with us also Aaron Bradley II. Aaron is a lawyer and Dallas Nightlife influencer who at one time had nearly 41,000 followers in his social media presence. We'll talk about that a little bit. I'm also very excited to have the Kenny Reeves. Kenneth Reeves is a podcaster and community activist, co-founder of Good Culture. Good Culture is a group that brings people together in art, culture, business for networking and collaboration. And finally, you can't see him, but we have Drew Green. Drew Green is a sales executive and as a volunteer is one of the co-leaders of the 24-hour Dallas Respect and Inclusion team. Much of what's happening today is because Drew has led us to this moment. My name is Randall White, and I am a volunteer for 24-hour Dallas. Our co-sponsor today for this webinar is Ella Torre, a consulting firm in community relations and public affairs. And then we'll also be posting this webinar at the 24-hour Dallas page, 24hourdallas.org on our website. By this time tomorrow, it will be up so you can see it. Now, before we start, bathrooms are down the hall. Since it is happy hour, I hope you all have brought your own beverage. We will talk, keep it down. We will talk with all of our guests. We'll come back with a little time for them to kind of ask each other questions and discuss something that might be relevant to the bigger picture or to the local picture. We'll take some questions from our audience. There's a little chat button at the bottom of your screen. There's also a Q&A button. You feel free to use either one of those and I'll triage those questions, as many as we can. And then toward the end of the hour, we're going to introduce to you what the volunteers of 24-hour Dallas would like to do regarding this particular issue in the city. Gentlemen, welcome. Our attenders include academics from around the world, nighttime economy advocates, including a whole cluster of colleagues from Seattle, restaurant and bar owners, and then a whole host of 24-hour Dallas volunteers. I thank all of you for joining us. I'm going to start with Dr. May. Dr. May, in 2014, you published Urban Nightlife, the book, and a major theme of this work is what you call integrated segregation.
Yeah.
What? What do you mean?
So, essentially, that's the idea that people are sharing in public space together. They're approximately close to one another, but actually they are very socially distant. And these lines are boundaries that keep people from actually integrating or interacting with one another. So this notion of integrated segregation, to the visible eye, it looks like there's integration, but in fact, people are carrying on in very segregated patterns. That's both by self-selection and also based on kind of institutional or structural rules that affect or impact the way that people interact with one another.
Okay, and you talk a lot, and I was very intrigued by your conversations or your writings about caravanning and the groups that caravan together, and how sometimes this affects racial dynamics between groups and between genders. Talk to me a little bit about what your studies have revealed about caravanning.
Yeah, so caravanning groups is essentially, I think most people would think about bar hopping groups, that idea of moving around from space to space and being with one another and sharing in engagement and interaction. These groups typically form or are formed through intimate connections that people have that occur before they actually make it to the nightlife. And so then their focus becomes the ways in which they move from space to space, looking to be with people like themselves and interacting with them people. The caravanning groups are also responsible in terms of gender dynamics, and this is in a kind of hyper heterosexual context. Gender dynamics, they are used as buffers from undesirable people in terms of engagement. So groups of women will help ward off undesirable males, or men will caravan collectively, and part of the sport, quote unquote, sport of it all is to engage and interact with women. And so those caravanning groups are important because they help to sift out or filter out or even protect people from certain kinds of engagements with one another.
And that behavior, that caravanning, the group behavior, if somebody is pulled out of that or separate from that or going to a place as an individual or two people, how different is that in terms of perhaps how welcomed they are at places, or talk about that.
So I'm sure you have many folks who are watching now who understand that groups are not as good as individuals or pairs with respect to how they're perceived. So the larger the group, the more problematic it may be seen as. The smaller the group, the pairs, it is better. Mixed gender groups are absolutely perceived as very differently than those who are all male or all female. And so the composition of the groups impacts the way that they're received. And there's certain groups, there's a hierarchy, just like in American society, with respect to how people perceive quote unquote threat or potential problems, with, of course, people of Black and brown backgrounds perceived as more threatening than those who are white. And so that they are also received or thought of in very different terms. And this is both by clientele and also with respect to management and management's perceptions of potential problems that are associated with those groups.
Is that false?
So I can't say that it's true or false, because you have, as you have problems with groups across a number of different categories, you can say it's universal, but the perception is still that there are more problems associated with Black and brown people than they are with people who are European descent. And so,
Sure.
so maybe it's a falsehood, or it doesn't matter whether it is or not. It is the perception of those people who are in charge or who are evaluating. And again, this is stereotypical kind of assessments that go on. Women are thought of as less problematic because they're seen as less of a threat. Men are seen as more of a threat. And then you change the hue or the color of people, and the threat level rises according to those people who are making the evaluations.
You know, it was very interesting to me as we kind of segue. I think what the other thing I discovered about you was an article you wrote for The Conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the name of the
Yes,
online magazine? And you revealed some data from a 1997 research project I think you did, where you took three pairs of men, right?
Yeah.
Talk about that and talk about what you discovered from that process. And we're starting to talk about dress code.
Okay, so I probably want to share a couple of things. I'll just say that the study is actually 2018 it was published, so this is recent.
Okay.
And we actually visited Dallas, Houston, and Austin, and we dressed pairs of white, and black, and Hispanic men in the same clothing. One was dressed as one who could conventional, conformist kind of clothing, and then the other kind of clothing associated with hip hop. And the other person was dressed in that manner. Some isolate or call it thug attire. And we took those young men to the nightclubs. And I always say, well, what do you think happened? That's my question line. And what I discovered was that African-American men, one in 10 visits were rejected because of dress codes, whereas the white and Hispanic men were rejected 1 in 20 times. So that means if you were a caravanning group, moving from nightclub to nightclub, you went to 10 places in one night, you're going to get rejected if you're an African-American male at least one time. Whereas you could go 2 nights in a row before you were rejected if you were white or Latino. And I should mention that these were brown Latinos, but again, this is in Texas. So the point is that there's a different kind of vibe and flow that goes with perceptions of threat, how you deal with that particular population. I do want to say that along with these kinds of the dress codes as one means, there's also what we discovered, which was called herding and corralling, which is essentially that bouncers would send Black patrons to other bars as a way to herd them or push them away, and they're corralled and held in that space, both socially and in the context of law enforcement, social control. We also discovered fake guest lists, where the bouncer will have a list of names, and on that list of names, the names are fictitious and they don't belong to anyone, but the bouncer would use the board as a prop to say, well, you're not on my list, you can't get in, where other people were allowed in, even though they were also not on the list. And then there's that differential pricing, so that at nightclubs, bouncers say, hey, if you want to get in, it costs $20. Whereas if, I guess there's a racial wage or cost to being admitted to the nightclub. So if it would cost you $20 if you were Black, whereas if you were white, it might cost you only 10, only 5. So there's a differential pricing. And of course, people know about these things and are frustrated and decide to leave from the nightclub. So these are all exclusionary tools that are used in the nightlife that we discovered through this research of visiting approximately 53 nightclubs in Austin, Dallas, and Houston.
Was there a particular neighborhood in Dallas you focused on?
Yeah,
I've been asked that question by one of our audience members.
Yeah, well, Uptown. So you know that works. Uptown is the area in Dallas.
Well, interestingly enough, the whole genesis of 24-Hour Dallas sprang out of conflict in Uptown between adjacent neighborhoods and nightlife businesses, some of them that were appealing specifically to the Black population. Yeah. And some tensions that were created there and some ordinances that wanted to be developed to manage that is what got us in the middle of all this. So I'm going to ask you one more question. This is from your book.
Okay.
And then I'm going to talk to the other guys. This is a quote, and you say, although America is becoming more racially and culturally diverse, the dichotomy of Black and white remains a central influence over how people engage one another on many city streets. Yet, perhaps more troubling is that many people fail to draw a connection between contemporary racial issues and the historical and institutional forces that support these ongoing issues. So that's kind of where we are in America right now, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I think that's highlighted in the protest and the marches. And the point is that we're not talking about individual kind of engagement. We're talking about historical and systematic engagement. And one last thing to tie it all in is that these dress codes, these corralling, these fake guest lists, these are part of a structural system. It's not individual nightclubs per se, but a collective effect coming from the way that clientele are treated in those contexts.
Well, we just read about a bar in Chicago that was having enough problems violating ordinances and et cetera, but still it seemed like they were also instituting some discriminatory practices at the door, and it was done intentionally I mean, it seemed like this was a corporate policy to just run afoul of any rules and guidelines. It just, unfortunately, that particular business has a presence in Dallas. I want to talk, we won't mention them by name though, gentlemen. Aaron, I'm going to come to you next. Because 24-Hour Dallas is all about things to do with our nighttime sociable economy, we began following a Twitter feed that you and several of your colleagues manage. And what caught my eye at one time was you have 41,000 followers, and that began to list some Dallas bars and restaurants and clubs where Blacks were not made to feel welcome. And some of the very practices Dr. May was talking about were being deployed. And after you guys began to kind of list those and call some of those out, and your members, your Twitter followers were posting, well, we have a problem with this one, boom, next thing I know, your entire Twitter account's suspended. What do you think, from your experience and from those stories of those folks in your Twitter feed and the world in which you have influence in social media, what are some of the specific experiences that show how social segregation still exists in the sociable economy, without naming names, business?
Without naming names. So talk about how it exists. So just the really popular places, they do different things basically to keep Black people out. They, like he said, they may fake like they have a list. Oh, certain, this is guest list only tonight. Certain places do that uptown where it's guest list only, or, oh, you're not in dress code, or they just make up a number of things. Oh, there's not any women with you. There's 4 guys here. Oh, we're not letting in any guys right now. They make up a number of things at the popular places in uptown and Deep Ellum to, I want to say, to keep us out really, and to keep a good ratio of us in there. I mean, they let us in, but it's at a very small amount. Like he said, in the caravan, if 10 of us walk up, all 10 of us are not going to get in. But if we walk up one, like sometimes what me and my friends may do, 2 of us walk up and then another 2 may wait and walk up later.
Ah, so there's workarounds. Sometimes.
Yeah, there's workarounds to it.
Is it your experience? I mean, what's up with that? Is it that does a business have any kind of right, or is it just wrong of them to say we want to keep a ratio or whatever they're saying?
So it's, since I've been young, it's kind of been like that in Dallas. Popular club used to have, it's called Purgatory. Right. And that's where I first experienced it. I was 18 and I went there with my cousin, and I was at college at the time, and I came back home and it's like, you got to come to Purgatory. And he was like, what kind of shoes do you have? I was like, huh? It's like, what kind of shoes you have? It's like, no Jordans. So I was like, okay, so I'm not going to wear Jordans. So I didn't wear Jordans. I wore Vans. And I get in the line, and there's other people that do have on Jordans that are not Black. So I'm like, okay, so are they going to get in? And I see them get in. So I get all the way to the front. I have a solid white shirt on. And he's like, let me see your shirt. And it's all white. He's like, oh, we're doing no solid color shirts today. And that was like my first experience. It was like, okay, I came all the way here from Denton. You know, my friends built this place up, said it was going to be fun. I wore the right shoes, and now my shirt is a solid color. You guys are not letting solid color shirts in.
Well, that's not particularly new. Back in my day, which is a long time ago, my poor fellow friends who are also waiters at restaurants in New York would sink all of their money into their shoes just so they could get into Studio 54. So that was, I think that's who knew to look at the feet. When I say though that the Black dollar is as strong as the white dollar, how do you want to kind of augment that statement to local businesses, bars, restaurants? How do you convince people that the dollar, if you're all about revenue, The black dollar is strong.
I'll give an example of, I can't name places, but I'll say there's a place in Uptown, Kenny knows, there was a place in Uptown that they didn't let a lot of black people in there for a long time.
Right.
Quite a while. I want to say probably never up until this past year, 2019, they made an agreement with some black promoters to start letting us in there on a certain day.
For a certain
I call it
time
the Black
period.
Day. Huh?
For a certain time period.
Yeah, for a certain time period on a certain day. We can only be at a certain time period. At that time period, it get kind of funny. But certain time period on a certain day, the Black Day, they let us in and we packed it out. Pack it out. There's bottles everywhere. I mean, it's probably their most packed night. And that's because they switched it up. They got with a black promoter and decided, hey, let's try this different. But for a while, I want to say years, I never even been in the place until then.
Right.
So it was like getting a tea time, right? You could come in from 7 to 8, but blah blah. And that's very interesting. And we'll talk about this perhaps in just a little bit. Dr. May and I were talking before you guys came on about business is tough right now.
Mm-hmm.
Have some of those discriminatory practices abated, but we'll come back to that. Kenny Reeves, the Kenny Reeves.
Hi.
You're by reputation. I knew you before Aaron introduced us to each other. And so tell me a little bit about good culture and what you and Terrence Lee started.
Yes. Yes.
And what you're wanting to accomplish, and then maybe how it dovetails with the nighttime, the music sector, the nightclub sector. Tell us about that.
So Good Culture is a lifestyle media brand founded by me and my close friend Terrence Lee. We actually started in Denton, Texas at UNT as another company called Home Team, but life took us a couple of different ways. So we reconnected as adults to create Good Culture. The biggest thing with Good Culture was just noticing that our demographic were traveling to other cities, Atlanta, Houston, DC, heavily black cities where they felt like they were more accepted, where there was more programming and things that were more susceptible for black people. What we wanted to do is to show the other black people here in the city that there's several talented people here. It's a lot of people doing this. Hey, you're a lawyer, let's connect you with other lawyers. Hey, you're an entertainer, let's connect you with other entertainers. So we created Good Culture as a space through a podcast that we started first, which is the Good Culture Podcast, which has now a following of over 70,000 listeners nationally. But we created the podcast and we interviewed people within our city and gave them a platform to feel like celebrities for a minute. And we kind of exposed other people. And we took them from the podcast to now, hey, we're doing this event. So it kind of garnered a lot of attention. People connected with the guests who were on our show at these spaces, and we created a lot of networks. And I feel that Good Culture was a large part of the Black resurgence here in Dallas of
Sure.
just creating nightlife and lifestyle entertainment.
And your website is goodculture.life.
Goodculture.life.
Now tell me a little bit, you recently tweeted about your pledge to the culture.
Yes.
When you were promoting this webinar today,
Right.
you said you referred to your pledge to the culture. What is that? What is that?
So just speaking through the different microaggressions that Aaron and Dr. May have spoken through, with now being in this space for over 6 years, Good Culture has generated revenue in places who don't particularly want us to be there. We did an event at a place in Deep Ellum, and we generated over 30,000 on this day from noon to 6 p.m. A lot of spaces don't even make money in that time frame. But the lady afterwards said, now the worst part of our day is over. We made $30,000 for you, and you think of us as the worst part of your day. So just through thinking of these experiences and these kind of under the table handshakes where we'll agree to have a tea time or so, it gets to a point to where you no longer want to accept that. You no longer want to expose your demographic to that type of behavior. So I made a pledge along with Terrence and the rest of the Good Culture to no longer patronize these places, no longer bring them business. The place that I'm speaking to you about is currently closed. Our $30,000 that we were putting into the place is a large reason why they were above water. And what we know is that there is strength in the Black community. There is strength in our patronizing patterns. And, hip hop is America's largest export. It's the #1 streaming service, the #1 streaming genre of music. And we know that there's power in that.
Dr. May knows there's power in hip hop too. He has a character, an alternative character he does that uses hip hop to help teach as well. I actually saw a video of that some time back. I remember once I read that about your profile, Dr. May, I thought, oh, he's that guy, because I'd seen something about that on television. So Drew, now that I've got you here, a couple of years ago, on behalf of a client, I was producing a political fundraising event for a local elected official. And Drew was there, and that's where we kind of connected. And I tell you what, I don't remember much about the evening except for the fact that Drew and I talked all evening long about these very issues from his own experience. And that's when the recruitment of Drew into 24-Hour Dallas as a volunteer began. And now he's on our leadership team. So Drew, tell us a little bit from your experience. It parallels what we're hearing from Kenny and Aaron and what Dr. Mayer's talking about as being a single and free man out there working in Dallas. Tell us how that has informed what 24-Hour Dallas is focusing on.
Okay, well, I would first, Aaron and I have talked about this before. My experiences growing up in Dallas are much the same. I have been invited to happy hours for work in certain places in Uptown and Deep Ellum, and I'm in a sport coat, very nice shoes, just dressed, coming out of a high-end meeting and just going to meet the rest of my coworkers. And this one evening about 3 years ago, I happened to be about 20 minutes late because I was wrapping some stuff up at the office, and I got stopped at the door, and they told me I couldn't get in because they were full. Yet they were still letting people in behind me, which was pretty hilarious. So I had to go and call my boss, who was throwing the party, who rented out the room and so forth. And he had to come out there and, essentially, work the system around to where I can be allowed to enter into a place that was in no way full. And they were just being that way because, in my opinion, because I was Black, of course, being that that's not the first time I've experienced something similar to that at that venue. But 24-Hour Dallas, it probably began as an economic discussion because, I'm a fairly well-traveled individual. You go other places that are open 24 hours or at least later on in the night where there's no overlay laws. And, it is a more vibrant economy, a more inclusive environment typically because they have to find out ways to make things work and to let everyone who participates feel safe and feel like they have a home to where their businesses can succeed and that they, keep all the obvious, points of concern at bay. But as we got into this, we started kind of courting off into teams, and respect and inclusion just became a thing that I really was very passionate about because not only with my experience with this, but just knowing how, even from the economic discussion, how excluded the Black dollar has been, not only just in patronage to places, but also in inclusion as far as business owners being able to be in the prime, money-driven, parts of the city to where they can actually take advantage of, being in certain areas that are quote unquote safer or have higher dollar, surrounding, areas or people who live there or whatever the case may be. So that's kind of what I see. And I really wanted to, I've been very intrigued by Kenny and Dr. May and Aaron, of course, just with everything they've said, because we all kind of are in agreement through what we've seen in our life experience and what also we know to be a very good opportunity here. And, any strong movement or system is more powerful and effective when everyone's involved and when everyone has a seat at the table. And I know that, one of my mentors told me a long time ago, and Randall, I think, knows this guy too. He said, if in every situation, you're either at the table or you're on the menu. So this is going to be something where we look to have everyone be at the table to where we, with the changes we do have going forward and that we do enact, we can all just really benefit from it and just change this world in the way that it's trying to go right now.
Okay. A colleague that I know is very involved with the restaurant association industry wrote in, African-American black man who's a executive with a particular industry related business. He said, he says, it's not about our dollar. It's about us as people. That's the exact problem, Randall. It's not about profit. It's divisive. They don't want us in them. So they give us black urban nights, and that's all you hear when you keep us out of those spots.
Oh, of course.
So it just comes down to racism, right?
Right.
Isn't that
Yeah,
just it? Especially, is this more predominant in the South, Dr. May? I mean, you've studied Atlanta, you've studied Austin.
So it's basically everywhere.
Is it everywhere?
And
Portland,
I think it's an important distinction that can be made here too. So one of the other questions that popped up was whether this was the exclusionary tactics were based on the bouncers themselves or or directives. Most of this comes from directives of owners.
Right.
And then the second part to that is some of us assume that owners are racist in their application of these things, but there's also an economic consideration. If the clientele you're working with or dealing with doesn't want to be around black people and you're trying to make money, then it becomes an economic consideration. So there's economic incentive to be racist in that context. Even if you're a black owner of a white club in Uptown, for example, there's economic incentive to do that. So we have to figure out a way to disincentivize this idea of race and segregation in those contexts.
Interesting. And someone else writes in, are we seeing this practice in restaurants or is it just clubs and maybe bars? Do you see this in like traditional restaurants in Dallas, perhaps, or in other cities, restaurants?
This is definitely in all of those venues. It's what's called public entertainment venues, public accommodation venues, and there is consistent in all of these spaces, especially in places like Chicago and New York, where these places also double as nightlife establishments later on.
Okay, hence the word public in your book, right?
Yeah.
This is about the public space, the public realm, the shared space with other people.
And there is a law against those things, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but proving that someone is in violation of that act has become more difficult. And also we have less enforcement of that given the current overall climate about pursuing civil rights issues like this.
Right. Someone else wrote in saying, isn't this against the law? Isn't it against the law to discriminate? Yeah, but your point about enforcement and the reality of that it's not a feasible, possible thing. Gentlemen, do you have any questions you'd like to ask of Dr. May? He's got this academic expertise. He's got a network of colleagues who are watching right now. Is there anything you would like to convey to him that you think that perhaps he doesn't already know or hasn't already uncovered?
There
you go. One at a time. Let's start with Aaron, since I met you first.
What are some solutions that you have in mind, Dr. May, as far as next steps that we can take?
Yeah, so I think that you have to consider two things. One is, do you want to patronize places that don't particularly want you there? Right? That's the first question. And the second question is this going to be an act of protest for making things better, right? So those are the key questions, because you can make a choice not to go. People say vote with your dollars, and so you can make a choice not to be involved in those contexts. I believe that you should take some kind of action to make things better. And that means to highlight those places in much the way that you probably had done, Aaron, and pointing out particular places, but bringing the secondary level of pressure, which is actually taking the steps of legal action to bring people in line. Because the truth of the matter is, as long as you have incentive to discriminate and there's no recourse or action taken, then people will continue to do it and take their chances. As I said before, I was invited to be an expert witness in a case in Portland, and ultimately the owner had done some very explicit things and had to settle out of court. But it also opened up a space for an African-American male to purchase a nightclub in a high value area, and was able to build his own clientele in that way. So I think you have to be able to follow through with the legal means in order to generate this kind of response.
Yeah, Kenny, did you have another question, Dr. May?
Me and Aaron pretty much were asking the same question, but to piggyback, when we say take legal action, what exactly are we doing? A lot of people just would think that, hey, we just have to accept these things and this is how they are, this is how times are. But if you're saying that we should take legal action, what exactly would those steps be?
So typically,
I want to add to what you just said, Kenny. A lot of these places have political power as well. They're giving big donation money. So to like attack them legally is kind of hard. They're giving big donation money to city officials here.
Yeah. So one of the first things that you can do is there typically are human rights councils in the cities. And you can start with the Human Rights Council by writing a formal letter. Most people who have complaints about these kinds of things, they get frustrated, get mad and walk out, and that's it. They don't do anything about it. They're just like, I don't have to deal with this. But write formal letters detailing these events and include those to the Human Rights Councils or I think it's Human Rights Councils in the local areas. And then there are law firms where people do work to take on these kinds of cases. I don't know of any particular in Dallas.
Okay.
But what you can do is, I can tell you, if you look up court cases in which people filed about discrimination, you can identify attorneys who actually take on these causes because they're more concerned about making sure people do things right. And so those are two early steps you can take, I think.
Okay.
I just, a whole slew of people have been trying to get in, and I just released a new crowd of folks to the group. Here's a couple of more questions, and then I'm going to share with you kind of what 24-Hour Dallas has been thinking about doing in this arena. I've already shared it with the guys, but kind of tell you what it actually addresses much of what you're talking about, except without the legal action part. But this was an intriguing question from, I'm guessing, Dr. G. May Barlow. Do you know who that would be? What impact does this behavior have on the social relationships, of any, of African-American males and females towards one another? Dr. May?
Yeah, so that's a fascinating question because oftentimes both men and women receive differential treatment. So, but in recently, women have been receiving the same kinds of treatment, the same kinds of turn down treatment. But the old trick was that you rejected the men and the women had no desire to go to the place because there was anybody they could interact with. But now women are actually receiving frontal assaults on things like dress codes, which is fascinating because by and large, women are not subjected to those dress codes. I don't know that it has any direct impact on the way that men and women engage one another or interact with one another within the context of the nightlife, but it certainly has it's certainly a way to be divisive between men and women outside of the context. When you allow one set of people in, say women versus the men, then that creates certain kinds of tension.
Yeah.
How
come you got to go in and I didn't?
Yeah. Or they got to go in and so they are able to enjoy the social context and we are not. And so there's a tension there with that.
Mm-hmm. We have another question here that asks about, because we have some hospitality people in our group, hotels, etc. Is there experience here in the hotel sector?
Definitely.
Okay, Kenny. Yeah. Okay.
Most recently, without saying names, there were popular DJs that were from African American community at a brand new hotel in Dallas. We'll just leave it at that. And they recently lost their residencies due to the demographic that they brought out, which made certain people feel uncomfortable. And that's something that got really big on Aaron's social media page, and it kind of traveled throughout the course of the city. We were fighting on this and fighting on this to the point to where there were apologies issued from the hotel. So these are practices that we've seen in hotels, and that's just not the only one. That's the most recent incident that we can speak to, but it's pretty prevalent.
Well, go ahead. Did you want to say something, Dr. May?
I was just going to say that this is documented in restaurants, in hotels, nightlife. So this is an extension of all of that. Again, public accommodations venues in general.
Okay. All right. Well, I've had Drew and I have had the opportunity to meet with Aaron and Kenny and AT and Senio and several other folks, as well as some of our own volunteers. And on the issue of this kind of systemic problem in the nightlife community in Dallas, we have proposed an initiative that we would like to take on, and I would like to introduce this. They've all seen this, Dr. May, you have not. But if you don't mind, I'd like to take about 5 minutes here just to kind of go through what we're proposing as a volunteer entity. And we're going to need a lot of help to pull some of this stuff off. But this is one of the ways we'd like to do something so it's more than just about this temporary ceremonial thing that you're seeing, where we paint something and then it's going to be gone in a year. We want to affect change. So let me just share this with you and talk through this. All right. We know that it's not going to play. Here we go. Since the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, America seems to be awakening to the ways bias and prejudice are woven into our culture. We have re-examined America's unjust past, and we have contemplated potential heartbreak of America's future. Unless there is deliberate change by day and by night, there never will be change. America won't change. Dallas won't change. We're going to ask the people on this call, as well as the community, to help us take racial stigma and fear out of Dallas's nighttime economy. This is a direct quote from our leader, Drew Green. And we're going to call this initiative Every Voice. This is, of course, taken from the anthem, Lift Every Voice. And let me kind of break down what we heard and how we're going to respond. From conversations with Aaron and Drew and Kenny and others, I think of it as like a call and response, like the gospel music of my childhood, where someone would say something and the congregation would respond. So the call is what we heard, and the response is how we're going to respond to that issue in the Dallas nightlife economy. We heard increase the number of Black proprietors of nighttime restaurants, bars, and clubs in the city of Dallas. The opportunity isn't the same. There are more challenges for Black and other races to open businesses at night. So our response is ownership. We would like to develop a program that identifies and reduces racial bias and prejudice in Dallas City Hall's review and approval processes, because some of the problem, in fact, exists in our own City Hall mechanisms. Surprise. We also want to create clear and inclusive, from idea to opening, nuts to bolts communications from Dallas City Hall that includes step-by-step guides with all the considerations for opening a new business. It doesn't exist. So our first response is to help ownership. The second thing we heard is to help existing nighttime businesses, events, and venues be more welcoming of Black customers and audiences. Our response is hospitality, a hospitality response. We want to develop a program like the one we want to do at City Hall that will help identify and reduce bias and prejudice in the policies and practices of Dallas's sociable nighttime economy, the public space that Dr. May talks about. Our third request that we heard was honor those businesses that welcome Black customers. Somebody wrote in, why are we even going to these places that don't want our business? We want to flip that and honor those businesses that welcome us. And our response to that is a recognition program. We're going to create a simple accreditation program that identifies welcoming businesses in a way that says you are welcome here and excludes those folks that exclude Black customers. We also heard alert the general public to the issues of racism in the nighttime economy. Our response to that is awareness, hosting public conversations on race and the night, beginning with this one today. Promote those accredited businesses, businesses that go through a process to say, we're going to do everything we can do to break that conscious and subconscious prejudice and bias in our operations in front of house. We also want to provide the media, Dr. May, with insights and resources on racism and the nighttime economy. We're going to plug right into everything you're doing. We also heard, the call we heard was assist Black performers in venues that are struggling right now due to the coronavirus pandemic. And our big response to that will be a unity effort. We want to coalesce Black and allied performers and venues in a series of streaming events that raise funds for Dallas's Black performers and venues. So those are the Every Voice components of the initiative we're proposing. I'll go through them one more time. The elements include an ownership response to address the absence of Black-owned businesses at night and the challenges that are faced there. A hospitality response that helps those businesses that do not seem hospitable to the Black community be more so. A recognition response that helps recognize those businesses that welcome the Black customer. An awareness initiative to build and increase the awareness in our media and in our community about this very issue. And then a unity response that helps everybody come together in a way that raises funds to help the Black community, the businesses, nighttime venues, and the performers in particular that are suffering perhaps most because of the double whammy of the pandemic and prejudice. So that's what we're going to call the Every Voice Initiative, and we're going to ask the community to help us take racial stigma and fear out of Dallas's nighttime economy. So that's one of the things 24 Hour Dallas is proposing. We have a team of volunteers already at work on some of this, wanting to make some of this happen. The one piece that we talked about here that isn't included in there is the legal action piece. I'm not sure if that's going to be something for us to take on, but I certainly would like to see us collaborate with you got to have the hammer over here sometime and then the reward. You know, we'd like to say, here's the path, here's the more, here's the better path. But let people know that there's a hammer out there. And perhaps Aaron and Kenny and some other guys would want to be a part of the hammer. So that's what we're proposing, and that's where we're going to go. Do you have any initial thoughts to that presentation, Dr. May?
I think that one of the things that I think is impressive is the idea of engaging ownership and also clearing space for African Americans to take part in the context of some of these high value places. And I think along with that, one of the things that we have to be aware of is that there's a systematic issues with, in terms of licensing, in terms of who gets to open where, and then there's also enforcement of certain kinds of violations that people are targeted more frequently than others. And so that's something to keep an eye on too. Yeah. But I like the idea that that's an engagement level, because it's about opportunity that's systematically shut off, and it addresses that.
Well, and we had another question about that, about insurance rates and all those other things that are built into various corporations that really are just about creating obstacles. creating obstacles for opportunity. And from my perspective, it's vestige behavior of slavery. It is still this, I'm here and you're here. And we're going to have all these things in place that prevent you from being here.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is that just me as the liberal white guy kind of going, or is that an honest assessment of what's going on?
I think that is an honest assessment of what's going on. And I think that's one of the reasons why the direct engagement through the proper mechanisms and means, like dealing with ownership and dealing with licensing, and that is a very important step, because truthfully that, those challenges are created in a context in some ways to prevent people from accessing these things. I think the idea, and I think Aaron pointed this out in his comments about lawsuits and donations and stuff, they just basically wear you out. And so until you just like, oh, whatever, but the people who continue somehow prevail in many contexts. And so I think, again, this is a step in trying to push this. And I hope that there's energy to sustain these activities, because you're going to meet with some challenges on that front.
We already have.
Okay.
We've already had people caution, do
Yeah.
you guys really want to go there?
Yeah.
And here is, I see another comment here. Somebody writes that they hear about, back to insurance rates. I'm hearing about hip hop shows are charged more insurance rate than other kinds of shows. Here's another question I'm curious about, gentlemen, if somebody wants to answer. Are patrons who are discriminated against typically reporting the incident?
No, they are in fact not. Most of them go because there's a sense that there's the sense that this is nobody's going to really pay attention to it. Nobody's going to believe it. Nobody's going to address it. There's a certain amount of emotion that goes into those rejections. There's humiliation related to it, and people don't want to live those over and over again. So they just don't file reports. They're just like whatever. So it has to be a sustained effort, and it's like other kinds of actions that they require sustained effort and a collective action, so to speak. So my incident won't be the same as, Aaron pointed out his incident and Kenny pointed out his incident, and we collectively pursue this together and sustain our energy from that. So that's a major challenge too, because people often just don't report. I think I have 41 incidents between 2000 and 2014, and only 21 of them had ever led to any kind of official kind of action. So you see it in the news, but it never leads to an official kind of action.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll take it a step
go ahead, Aaron. Go ahead.
I'll take it a step further and say a lot of those venues have local law enforcement working for them and are close by. And I've seen several instances where a guy's like, hey, you guys didn't let me in, and they go grab the officer and say, hey, if you don't want to leave, then we're gonna have to get the officer to arrest you.
Yeah, certainly what I'm talking about is always outside of after the event, after the occurrence. It's a focused strategy move to take care of it, because you're not going to win any kind of confrontations in those contexts.
People typically don't report. I know me myself, I've never thought of reporting because there's usually an officer right there. So it's kind of like, hey, and the person usually tells the officer the story, like, hey, he doesn't want to let me in. And they're just kind of.
So if we had some built-in report mechanism where people knew the next day, sort of like a not Yelp or not necessarily social media, but something that said that recorded these incidences and had perhaps some teeth or some political teeth to them, would that be of value?
I think that'll be definitely a valuable resource, because in our community, there's a large distrust for law enforcement. So even making the report is something that we're not even typically inclined to do. But if we knew that, hey, this is something that's going to advance the cause, there's some political reinforcement here, and this is a resource for our community, that's a position that we could all take and get behind. So I think that it'd be a great resource for all the people.
Well, I feel fairly confident, Drew, and disagree with me if you think, but don't you think we have enough friends on Dallas City Council that might want to pursue something like this? It might funnel into some policy-making board at City Hall?
I know for a fact we do. And that's something we've kind of communicated before, is that with starting this whole thing, we know that with the relationships we bring to the table, that we definitely can get the ball rolling and make some significant strides to solving a lot of these problems and really making good on a lot of the ideas that were in Randall's PowerPoint. So I would definitely agree, Randall.
Okay. Well, I do want to say one other thing here. I see one comment saying what a great program. And as you may know, one of our restaurants would be very interested in speaking with Kenny or Aaron, or even participating in the recognition program. When is that going to start being available? So already, we're not even that far down the chute, and already there's interest from just folks who are watching. I do want to say, we're kind of coming close to the end of our time. This always flies fast. Dr. May, it's a great honor to meet you and see you finally face to face. I suspect our paths will cross again. Gentlemen, Kenny, Aaron, you have not seen the last of me, and I'm going to count on your involvement in some way in what we do here. If we can figure that out and figure out maybe how it even dovetails into good culture stuff, Kenny, and dovetails into your social influence realm, I'm sure Drew will help us get there. So I would like to thank you, Dr. May. Thank you, Kenny. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Drew, for joining us. So thanks to Elatori, our co-sponsor. If the people watching would like to be involved with 24 Hour Dallas, just go to our website, 24hourdallas.org, or use the contact page there if you'd like to be specifically involved in our Every Voice initiative. We're going to need every hand to pull off every voice. And I would appreciate you contacting us through that. The last thing I want to say is next month, there's this interesting thing brewing at City Hall that has to do with new parking ordinances. I bring that up. We'll probably have a focus on webinar next month, because the parking ordinances were being used originally 4 years ago to help create some of those barriers to prevent some Black folks from attending clubs in Uptown. So now there's more discussion again for the first time about parking ordinances, but instead of making them more restrictive, which is what they were trying to do 4 to 5 years ago, now they're talking about loosening things up. And so I think we're going to have a conversation about that. It won't just be, it'll be of very interest to our planners and our hoteliers and our restaurateurs and bar owners who are a part of our membership. So again, 24 Hour Dallas, you're welcome to join us as a business, as an agency, as an individual. Let's create a safe, vibrant, and nighttime culture for businesses, residents, and guests. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you again, gentlemen. This will be available on 24hourdallas.org sometime tomorrow. All right?
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
All right.
Thanks a lot, everyone.